Welcome back to another year of Final Fantasy, and we're ushering in the month of Ifrit. Now, why Ifrit? Well, it's because I live in Texas, and summer in Texas is insufferably hot. So I figured it's Ifrit's domain, and if you actually look back in the past couple of months, I tried to keep it kind of going with the seasons or whatever. Anyway, enough of my rambling, let's get on to this. As this is the 7th month of a year of Final Fantasy, you know that we cover one major game in the franchise at the end of each month, and we're obviously up to the 7th game, which of course is Final Fantasy VII, a highly obscure gem of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy VII was one of, if not the most critically praised game, at least at the time. Now, of course, we can look back and a lot of people, have their own feelings about the game, but I think it's safe to say that the game is one of the most highly talked about games in the franchise, regardless of if you love it or you hate it. So if Final Fantasy VI made the series into one of the most well-known best JRPG franchises of all time, Final Fantasy VII certainly cemented that. So this month we're going to be focusing on Final Fantasy VII and all of its companion spin-offs, but first we have to talk about the upheaval of the Final Fantasy franchise and what happened after Final Fantasy VI. So we're going to start that topic here and then we'll expand upon it as we get further into the proper game itself. Anyway, let's take a brief look at this Final Fantasy VI tech demo. The demo in question is known as Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game. This tech demo was circulated around the internet with some pretty big misinformation, namely that it was supposed to be a remake of Final Fantasy VI for the Nintendo 64. This obviously is not the case, though it does appear that some aspects of that story are linked, but it's not just in a major overt way that you might have thought of before. So let's look at some of the quotes that Mr. Sakaguchi had to say about the game, and he says, "In August of '95, one of the US largest CG convention, SIGGRAPH, was held in Los Angeles. At that time, we were not sure what the next generation RPG game should look like, so as an experiment, we created a CG-based game like an interactive demo to be presented at the show. It focused on battle scenes that were 100% real-time and polygon-based. So, as the SNES and the 16-bit consoles started to wind down, a new wave of gaming systems were about to be unleashed, and the two biggest of those were the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation, and this would be the first major splitting of the video game market as a whole. And what was that catalyst to do it? Well, that was CDs versus cartridges. CDs could store a ton of information compared to cartridges, however the systems that used CDs were much less powerful than its counterpart. Also, it contributed to long loading times and some other various negative side effects. But even then, at this point, Mr. Sakaguchi was saying that they had no idea what they were going to do going forward. It wasn't just assumed that they were going to go with the Nintendo 64 when we had this new major player out. It was apparent that the games were beginning to move into the 3D realm, and as such it was a huge learning curve for everyone in the industry. Square decided to approach Silicon Graphics to get some help with 3D model rendering. Another quote from Mr. Sakaguchi states, "After Final Fantasy VI was completed, the staff had some free time. We then started to think about what the new hardware there was and what we wanted to do with our next creations, and we created a movie as an experiment. At this time we were working with the SG-1 workstations, which had rendering software designed for the next generation hardware. For that reason, we thought it would be good if we continued using this setup for our next game. With the SG-1 software, we could develop graphics for any hardware. However, for our purposes, we didn't want a frame-by-frame slow rendering that takes many hours. We wanted to develop a way to render the visuals in real time for our new game." So these workstations they were provided with were the same capability to work on the new consoles, but that's not necessarily what the demo was made for. This tech demo was clearly a creative learning tool, and really nothing created with it could have been realistically ported to a console due to their limitations. The Silicon Graphics workstation, for all intents and purposes, gave the developers an unlimited amount of power, at least at the time. To see how things were done in 3D space and how good they could make them look is really, like I said, just a learning process. So they wanted to see how the game mechanics would work in a three-dimensional environment and how they could push the CG graphics on these new systems. So with that, they created a tech demo with familiar Final Fantasy VI characters. When the public saw this, rumors immediately began to spread everywhere and people were jumping to conclusions about the remake that simply just wasn't true. There was never any plans to remake Final Fantasy VI, at least at the time. And this would not be the first time that this would happen, as whenever we get to the PlayStation 2, they showed off a Final Fantasy VIII tech demo, which also led to speculation that they were going to remake Final Fantasy VIII. And when PlayStation 3 came out, they revealed a Final Fantasy VII tech demo, which, you guessed it, led to speculative rumors for Final Fantasy VII being remade. Now, of course, right now in 2017, we know that they are making a remake of Final Fantasy VII, but this is nothing to do with that tech demo that was shown. Anyway, back to the Final Fantasy VI tech demo. During the course of creating this demo, it was apparent that if they were going to do something on this scale, it required space. And a lot of it. And that space was only available on the PlayStation due to the CD-ROM capabilities, and so Square jumped the Nintendo ship and began exclusively developing for Sony to realize their vision. And it would be many years before a new Final Fantasy game would resurface on a Nintendo system, and that game would be Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which we've actually already talked about. The tech demo itself was simply just a battle system. Different sort of tracing mechanics were used to pull off attacks as well. It was similar to how Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow uses them with the Nintendo DS. However, the tech demo only made use of controllers, so it's pretty funny. So nobody could actually pull off this symbol drawing to attack in the battle system. I don't know, I thought that was funny. But of course, whenever you're developing for something new, you're gonna have a lot of failures, but from those, it's really learning from them. And regardless of all the failures that this tech demo had, there was a lot of information that was learned and gained from the experiment. And the first and probably largest influence that they figured out from this demo was that the demo itself was 20 megabytes or so. And remember, we're just talking about one battle here. 20 megabytes right now doesn't sound like anything. At that time, look back at Final Fantasy VI's size. On the Super Nintendo, it was 3 megabytes, the entire game. This one battle system was 20 megabytes, and that was pretty much the nail in the coffin, looking at whether they were going to go with Sony or whether they were going to go with Nintendo. It cemented the fact that they must develop on CDs if they wanted to provide a game with this type of battle system, not to mention the long structures and narratives of the story. So PlayStation was the victor, Nintendo was in the past at this point, going forward with Final Fantasy VII. And there's not much more to say about it, honestly. It's a pretty fascinating behind the scenes kind of event, and it's pretty interesting what could have been, but it's pointless to dwell on that now. Regardless, the next big Final Fantasy would use this information gained and create an instant masterpiece we all know as Final Fantasy VII. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.